Now we're going to get into a little bit more of a complex lesson here. We're going to talk about custom training our model using the embeddings endpoint and Pinecone, which is a vector database. Now, if none of that made any sense, don't worry, because we're going to go over it in this lesson. By the end, you'll have a basic understanding of how this can all work and how you can apply it in your Bubble app yourself. The first thing I want to cover is actually OpenAI's docs. So you can see here, we're in the OpenAI docs. We're under embeddings, and you can just read through this on your own and go in depth as you want with it, because there's a lot when it comes to embeddings and vectors and how it really works in the back end. But for our purposes, we really don't need to understand that. All you really need to know is embeddings are a store of vectors, and vectors are a list or an array of numbers that represent a piece of text. So how it works is when you upload, say, an embedding or text, it then vectorizes each piece of that text into numbers. That is now a list or an array of numbers, and that list or array of numbers is now known as an embedding. So that is kind of how the structure works when it comes to uploading text to embeddings and then storing them as vectors. Now, when we talk about Pinecone in just a second, that is where that information gets stored. If we scroll down, you can see the output of what I'm talking about here in their example embedding response. Here is the embedding object, and as you can see, there is an array of numbers that are going to correlate to a piece of text. Now, how close the numbers are in value dictates how similar that text is to what the user is inputting. So for example, if I'm saying Tucker's favorite color is red, and then I embed that, and then I ask what is Tucker's favorite color, those vectors are going to be very similar in number size. So it's going to correlate those two together as being very similar and probably return you that result that you're looking for. That's kind of how it works. It's based off similarity search. How similar are those numbers when they get transferred into text? And again, you can read much more in depth on how all this works, searching, clustering, the recommendations, how it all works. There's even charts and graphs that depict dimensions of the various vectors based on their size and relationship to one another. You can go down a deep rabbit hole, but again, we don't really need to understand that. All we need to do is copy and paste our curl commands and understand just the responses and how to store the information. Let's do that. Let's just go ahead and copy this curl command, come over to our app. We're in our app, let's go to our plugins, and the first thing we're gonna do is find our API connector, go in past all of our other endpoints so we can collapse our speech to text if you still have that open. Go ahead and import this curl command, and let's rename this embeddings. Great, so we have our embeddings endpoint. Of course, we'll change it to action. You can get rid of your authorization. We'll just go ahead and leave content type for now. And really, there's only one thing to change here, which is the input from the user. So this is what we're going to be embedding. Now, think about what you're embedding as either a document or a large piece of text. It can really be anything so long as it is in text at the end. And really, the only thing we need to change here is this input. So this text is what we're going to be embedding and will act as our knowledge base. So we'll remove this, and of course, we will make it dynamic to let the user input whatever they want here. We'll just call it something like text, or even, let's say, user input. So we'll call this user underscore input. Then we'll go ahead and click over here, and we'll say Tucker's favorite color is red. It's not, I don't know why I said it's red, but we'll go with that for now, and let's just initialize this call. Make sure you uncheck that private so the user can actually have access to this. Let's initialize. You can see here we get our return object, and this is what it created. So this is what the embedding endpoint does. It takes text, and then it converts everything into these vectors and stores them in an embedding object. Now, when we get this, we need to take this and store it in Pinecone. So let's go over to Pinecone and see what that is and what we need to do with this, because we need to get this data and then transfer it over and then retrieve it from Pinecone. So OpenAI returns us something, we take that something, we give it to Pinecone. Pinecone takes that, now we get something else from Pinecone in return. And let's just walk through it because it'll make a whole lot more sense when we actually do it. So we'll save that. now that we have that embedding endpoint set up. So we're in Pinecone, and you should be on a page similar to this. Now, when you make an account, you'll basically just come to your projects, go to indexes, and we're going to be creating a new index. Now, when you click create new index, it's going to have you fill out this information. But what you need to know about indexes is that this is where your embeddings and vectors get stored once we take them from Bubble and upload them to Pinecone. They're going to get stored in an index. Now, for our purposes, we're just going to have one index per project. But if you're working on a more complex project, maybe you want to separate your knowledge bases out per organizations that use your application, it can get much more complex, but we're going to keep it very simple for now. So we're just going to give it a name, call it low code course. And then for the dimensions, we'll say 1536, leave the metric as cosine. Now, you don't really need to know what these mean for our purposes. It's out of scope, but 1536 really is just the number of vectors that are going to be stored in your embedding array. So we'll have 1536 per embedding, and that's going to equate to the number of vectors we have. But we don't really need to know that. Let's just move on. We have our starter plan, we have our cloud provider, and then we have our environment. So we can just go ahead and click create index. And now we are in that index. Now this is where we're actually going to be storing the embeddings and vectors. They're going to be showing up down here. So how do we connect this? Well, you come up here to the top right, and we're going to click connect. And now you kind of see something that is familiar. If we come down here instead of node and click shell, we have our curl command. So we're going to be looking for this. We want to copy our curl command. And the piece you're going to want to copy is the upsert. So we have upsert and query. Upsert is we're going to be taking that information from Bubble initially and storing it in Pinecone. And then query is when we're going to be asking Bubble a question or Pinecone, and it's going to be taking that embedding that's closely related to our question to provide the answer. So let's start with our upsert. Let's go ahead and copy and paste this. Come over to our API connector. We'll collapse the OpenAI endpoint or OpenAI API call. We're going to add another API. So this is actually going to be for Pinecone. Now, before we actually set up this endpoint, we have to assign our shared headers. So we're going to have two shared headers. Of course, we're going to have our content type, and then that's going to be application JSON. And then we're going to have our API key. Now let's go back and see how we should actually insert these keys and the value pairs, because again, it is dependent on their documentation. Come back to Pinecone. You can see that it says API key. So this is how it is going to be structured. And content type is also capitalized. So we need to change that back in our plugin. We will select API key, and we'll just capitalize our content type. It is application JSON. Now the only thing we need to do here is, well, go find that API key. So we come back to our Pinecone console. And right under here, under indexes, you have your API keys. Simply click it, and if you don't already have one, you can just create a new API key. I already do. In fact, I'll just create a new one because I need that private key, which probably disappeared. So we'll say low code course, or we'll just say low code, and we'll create an API key. So we have that. Let's show the key, copy that key value, and we'll just paste it in our API key. Okay, great. So now that we have that, let's move on to our import curl command. So you can get rid of the predefined one it gives you. So we're going to import from curl. Let's go back to our index. Let's connect. Let's copy the upsert curl. And let's go back to our plugin connector. And we'll copy and paste that in here. So now we import that. This is our upsert or our ingest endpoint. So this is when you ingest data. Now when we say ingest, it is really just a term that describes taking that piece of text, ingesting it, or turning it into vectors that are stored in embeddings. So when you think of ingest, just think of uploading your knowledge base to a vector database. Now, moving on, we can get rid of our shared headers. We don't need these. And look what it generates down here in our body JSON. A lot of random stuff that we actually need to change. So in this body JSON, we actually need to do a bunch of changes here to make this work. So right now, everything's dynamic, of course. So we're actually going to be getting rid of a lot of things here. In fact, we're going to be getting rid of 3 objects. So just scroll all the way down. You're going to want to end right here. Let me just make sure that's correct. Looks like it. and it will let us know if we have an additional curly bracket, and we'll get rid of that curly brace. Perfect. So we should be all good to go here with our new structure. The next thing we need to do is make this dynamic. So instead of vec1, we're going to have ID. We need to assign a random ID to the vector so it knows what it's looking for. Great. So now we get rid of the values here. Now for the values here, we're simply going to call it values, and this is where we're going to store those vectors inside the values array, and that's where those numbers are going to be stored. Now for metadata, we can just change this to text, as this is what the text is going to be from the user when they input something. So we'll give it a text dynamic variable. So for our namespace here, it's going to be dynamic, but we're going to give it a variable in the back end. So we'll just call it namespace, like so. And now let's get this API set up. So we need that initial trigger. Let's unprivate everything. So we'll have our ID, which we can just say 1 for now. Now for our values, this is going to be a little tricky because we need to put in there an array that has 1,536 vectors, and I don't want to type all that out and make that, and I'm sure you don't either. And if you try to do it in ChatGPT, it cuts you off and doesn't give you exactly what you need. So how do we do this? Well, let's come over to this website, onlinetools.com/integer/create tac integer tac array. Now, I'll probably provide this link somewhere so you can access it yourself or just give you the array, but it makes you and generates arrays based on your parameters. So here we start at 0. We also end at 0, and I put the length of the array to 1536. And this generated 1,536 zeros. So let's copy and paste all that. Now you can see those curly braces, leave those out of the equation. We'll copy and paste all the zeros. So let's go back to our API connector and put those in the values. Now one thing to note is I don't think it can be all zeros. So come to the very beginning and put it as 0.1. That way it gives you an actual value. Now for the text, we can go ahead and say Tucker's favorite color is red. Then for the namespace, let's go ahead and put low code course. So that is what we called our index. Now let's go ahead and initialize that call and get it all connected. So we initialize, it says unable to resolve DNS for your index endpoint. Now DNS is related to the URL that we specified in our API connector up here in our post requests. You can see we left this as your index endpoint, which is not a valid endpoint. It needs to be to our actual index. If we come back to Pinecone, you can see we are in our low code course index. So if you were to start here, you just click on your low code course index, and then you want to copy and paste this host URL. So copy that, and instead of your index endpoint, we want to go ahead and paste that in here. Let's get rid of that extra HTTPS. And now we should be good to go. And just be sure to put a little backslash here. So you have your host URL, your vectors, and then your upsert. Now we should be good to go. Let's initialize this call and see what we get. So we get our API connected, and you can see that we upserted one embedding, which is going to have that array of vectors. So the upsert count is 1. We'll go ahead and click save. And that's really all we need to do for the ingest piece. Now we need to set up the query. So what happens when we ask it a question? Well, we're querying that Pinecone database, or we're looking for something. We're looking for something similar to the vector we're providing. So it's going to do that similarity search and return us an answer that best fits what we gave it. So to do this, we need to go back to Pinecone and click connect. We need to go to our query endpoint. So just go ahead and copy and paste this over. Let's create a import from curl. We'll paste, we'll import. And we're going to need to change a couple of things here. But first, let's fix everything up here. Instead of curl name, we'll call it query. We'll say action. And right here, you see your index endpoint. We actually want to take that URL that we just put in our ingest and copy that over. So go ahead, copy, paste this. We'll collapse, come back to our query endpoint. We'll just paste it in here. Great, so we have that set up. We can get rid of API key. We can get rid of content type. Let's just focus on this JSON body because we don't need everything it's giving us. Again, we want to make this dynamic as well. So for the namespace, we'll just go ahead and write namespace. And I want to make it the same variable type. So I wonder if we put underscore here. We did. Let's go ahead and write name underscore space. And now let's fix our vectors. So get rid of all these 0.3s. We're going to do something similar, which is take that big array and copy and paste that over. So we'll come and select all these zeros. We'll copy. We'll come back to our editor, and we will paste those in for the value. But before that, we have to give it a dynamic variable. So we'll call it something like vector. And now we have that key value pair pop up where we can go ahead and paste in all those zeros. We'll come back to the very start and give it just a 0.1 so it has some value. We'll uncheck private, of course, but we're not done adding our values here. Go ahead and leave the rest. We can get rid of filter. We don't need that. And really, that's all we need to change here. Let's go ahead and set up this query. Before that, let's give it a namespace though. So we'll come to namespace. We'll give it our low code course name. And let's initialize this call. So we get an error here that says status code 400, parsing terminated before end of input, a data true, and it's giving us these two curly brackets. That probably means we don't need one of those. You can see here we have this extra one that we need to get rid of. Now we should be good to go. Let's initialize that call. And of course we get our return. Let's show the raw data and see what happened. So we get matches. Now keep in mind that's what we're going to be looking for later when we're doing our workflows is our matches, and it's going to give you an ID, a score, and the values associated where those vectors are. Of course, we gave it our variables dynamically or statically, so it just gave us these zeros, but it'll give us our actual vector when we do this live. Now, that is all set up. We can go ahead and collapse that, and all of our endpoints are good to go. The next thing we need to do is set up the design and do some simple workflows, and we're done. We're going to be able to upload specific knowledge and query it based on a user's input and what they uploaded to the knowledge base. So super cool. You couldn't get these results just on regular ChatGPT. It doesn't know my favorite color. It doesn't know anything about you or any outside data or personal data to you or your company, or you have SOPs. It's limitless what you can upload and make this work. But let's go into our design, start building it. So we'll add a new page. We'll call it Embeddings. And we'll create. So we're going to have a group, of course. First thing, we got to drag that group over. Let's get the group on the page. And then we're going to have 2 inputs and 2 buttons and somewhere to display the response. So we'll grab our inputs and just drag them on the screen like so. We'll have our next button. And this button is going to be for ingesting. So we'll call it ingest. This is the data or text or personal information, whatever is going to be ingested or you're training your model on, that is what is going to go here. The next thing is going to be the input, or where we query. We ask a question about the data. So let's drag a text. Nope, we will drag an input over. Let's drag our input from input forms right on the page like so. Then we'll have another button, which will just be our submit button or something like that, where we send our input as a user asking a question about the data. Then, of course, we want to display the response. So that is going to be a text box, and we'll just give it a decent-sized text box so it can fit all the text. Now, of course, how are we going to display it? In this case, we're going to be using state variables. I'm not going to be putting anything in the database. I'm just going to create a simple state variable. Then we're going to assign a value to that variable in order to display. So come up to your eye icon, and we're going to add a new custom state. We're going to say our AI response, and the state is going to be of text. We'll go ahead and create. Default value, we'll just leave blank. We'll call this output, just so we know what we're looking for. So we have output and then an AI response state variable. So we have everything we need here now to go and work on our workflows. Let's go set those up. We'll start with our ingest button. So we'll add a workflow. Now, the first thing we're going to do as far as steps is create our embeddings. That is always step 1, is using OpenAI's embedding endpoint to create the embedding. So a user will input text. We'll call the embedding endpoint that turns it into embeddings. The next step is then to ingest that into Pinecone. So text to vectors inside of an embedding. That embedding sends over to Pinecone. So let's do that. Let's go and find our embedding endpoint, see what we need to do here. Right now, we have the content type application JSON, the user input. Let's make this dynamic. So this is going to be our input A, and its value. So that's the first input. This will be turned into an embedding. Again, that's pretty simple. All we need to do is give it some text, send it to the endpoint, it turns it into embeddings. We don't need to worry about anything. The next thing is our Pinecone endpoint. So now we need to ingest that piece of data that gets returned from the embeddings endpoint. So we'll go to Pinecone, and we, of course, didn't make it an action for some reason. Let's go back and do that right now. We'll expand. Right now it's uses data. Go ahead and make that an action. I forget that all the time, so no worries. We'll go to our plugins. You can now see Pinecone ingest. So we'll select that. You see all these zeros. Get rid of that garbage. We're having an ID of 1. We're getting rid of that. We're just getting rid of everything here. You can leave the namespace. Again, we don't really care about making new namespaces. We're just going to have one index for this project. For ID, we want to generate a random string of numbers. So we insert dynamic data. If you type in calculate, we'll do a calculate formula. And what we want to calculate is or generate a random string. We're not really calculating. It's really just making a random string. The length of the characters doesn't really matter, but in our case, we'll just enter 10 and we'll hit close. Now, this is just going to be a random string of numbers that we're then going to be able to identify that piece of embedding or vectors. So for our value, this is going to be that huge array of vectors, and we need to get this from that embedding response. So when we call that embedding endpoint, it returns that response. And remember, in that response, it returns that array of vectors. That's what we're looking for. So we'll come to insert dynamic data. Result of step 1's embeddings. We'll go to data, and then we'll go to each item's embedding. And that is what we're going to be putting in for the values. Then for the text, all we're doing is taking input A's value as well. So we'll take input A, its value, and we are good to go there. So that's all we need to do to actually send this data to our Pinecone vector database. Go ahead and close that. The next workflow we need to do is work on that submit or query. So we'll add a workflow to our submit button. Again, we're going to be using the OpenAI endpoint at our embeddings endpoint. And go ahead and change this user input. Now we are looking or querying something. So again, we need to turn these text into numbers so they can perform that similarity search between the numbers we're asking about and the numbers we have stored. So again, we need to create these and turn these into embeddings. Take your input B value, and that is going to be your input there. Now, instead of our ingest, we're going to be querying. So just the exact opposite. You can see we have that long list of vectors again, but this time it's going to be the result of step 1, and then our data, and then each item's embedding. So same thing, and the last thing is taking whatever that response is, so our result of step 2, and displaying it. Because that is going to be what our response or output is from that query. That's going to be our answer. So let's set that state variable. We'll set a state. Select the element of output, and we call that AI response. The value here now is going to be result of step 2, that Pinecone query. It's matches, and then we're going to go with each item's metadata text. And you can see it's red here, so you look at the issue. See, the value should be text, but right now is a list of text. That usually means that you need to have one of these operators here, such as first item. That way it turns blue. You don't have a list, you just have one piece of text or one piece of content. Let's close that. Now, before we go and test this, let's go clear our Pinecone database because it probably triggered the creation of embedding or stored the embedding when we initialized that API call. So let's go to our Pinecone console. You can see if you scroll down, you see that piece of text that we sent when we set up our API call. So Tucker's favorite color is red. It assigns the values. We don't want this. We delete this vector so we can start from scratch. Now let's test this. Let's go to our design. One thing we still need to do is display that data. So we'll come here, we'll insert dynamic data. We're going to go ahead and get that output AI's response as our custom state, and we should be good to go. Let's go ahead and preview, and let's give it some information. So let's say Tucker's favorite color or animal is a tiger. Okay, so let's ingest that data. We'll go step by step and see what happens. Click ingest. Call that embeddings endpoint with that piece of text. It then returned these values or the array of vectors, which are all these numbers you see. Now to the computer, they mean something. To us, they don't mean a whole lot. Let's keep going. We'll run next. Now that should be ingested or stored in our database as vectors. Let's go to Pinecone and see if it worked. We'll refresh, come down here, and once it loads, we should be seeing that we have one match, which we do. Tucker's favorite animal is a tiger. Super cool. Then we have our value stored here, along with an ID of 1. Now, let's go back and see if we can't query this now that it's stored in our database. Remember, typically, OpenAI or ChatGPT is not going to know what my favorite animal is, so there's no way on earth it'll return or respond with tiger. There's just no way. So let's go ahead and ask it. Say, what is Tucker's favorite animal? Now, let's go ahead and submit. Let's run through the steps. Again, we're doing the OpenAI embedding endpoint call again because that's going to be our query vectors. We need those vectors to, well, perform a similarity search on the vectors we have in our database. So we have 2 lists of array that have vectors in them, and they're trying to perform a similarity search between the 2, getting us the answer to our question. Let's run next. You can see these vectors get made here. Run next again. You can see that it assigned the state variable a value. It says Tucker's favorite animal is a tiger. We'll run next. You can see it display right here. And that is just so cool that we're able to create our knowledge base all through using these APIs and Bubble with very little to no code and store custom data that we're able to then reference using AI. I think that is just so cool. There's so many use cases you could use for this. So you got to go out there and be creative because this tech is super cool. It's super new. Everyone's trying to use it, come up with different ideas on how they can use it. Now, what you can do with this is limitless. There's so much you could do with this kind of tech. Just using these simple APIs, very little code and Bubble, and we're able to make super complex applications. Again, I encourage you to go out there and build something more complex than this. Add more data, make it look way better, perform different functions. Just get creative with it. Once you start to understand how the data works together, how it flows, you can do some very cool things. So I can't wait to see what you guys build. If you do build something pretty cool, go ahead and share it with me in the Discord community. I'd love to see it and test it out myself. But I hope this all made sense. Again, do a little bit more research on this. Go and look at what embeddings are, what vectors are, how they work together, if that's something that interests you. If not, you know how to do it and work with it either way. So it's really up to you. But with that, I'll see you in the next lesson.